Hello, everybody, and welcome to DEVI Sansthan. This is your host, Ashutosh, and I welcome you to another insightful and lovely episode of Disruptive Talks, our exclusive talk show called D-Talks, where we invite dignitaries from the education, literacy, and the social impact field, and we discuss multiple issues, multi-variety of pedagogies, and what can be done more in literacy and education to bridge the gap and impact the lastest person and go beyond the limits. Today with us, we have an extraordinary personality. We have Mr. Mark Parkinson, who's an education executive. He's currently residing in Cambodia. We welcome you, Mark. Welcome all the way to DEVI Sansthan.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here.
We're really glad to have you here. So, just before we move on with the talks and the conversations, today we are talking about the efficacy and the transformation of school systems and education through alternative methods. Now, what are these alternative methods? What are we going to talk about? It's all on the questions that I'll be asking Mark today. So you have all the stage today, Mark. So I'm really excited to talk to you.
It's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes. Before we move on, just a quick introduction to the personality that is Mr. Mark Parkinson. He is an education executive and consultant who's currently residing in Cambodia, and he's the board member of the Delhi Rugby Club. He's also been the CEO of multiple school networks, starting from CIA International Schools in UAE, going to 10B schools in Malaysia. 10B schools, by the way, are one of the topmost schools of Malaysia. He's also been a senior manager in the private banking sector in the UK since he spent about 11, 12 years in the private banking sector. And please correct me on the information if I'm somewhere wrong. Until 2012, Mark was also the director of one of the biggest day school chains in India, the Sri Ram Schools. And his expertise lies in education leadership, teacher training, progressive education methods, and progressive training. And currently, he's working and studying something called happiness studies, which also involves the ideas of entailing happiness within students, teachers, and the education perspective. Mark, such a great portfolio you have. How do you feel today?
I feel like I still have an awful lot of work to do in life, and that I'm still learning as well. But more than anything, I feel that whatever progress we've made in education in the time that I've had the good fortune to be working in education, there is still a very long way to go, and there's still an enormous amount that we can do, and not even that we can do, but that we must do if we're really to satisfy the remit of enabling each and every child to fulfill their potential in a world that's changing faster and faster, ever more rapidly changing, and we're still not necessarily doing the best job at that worldwide. And I guess that's why we're having conversations like we're having today.
Right. That's very truly pointed out because as somebody who's had an experience of setting up schools, working in the administration, I'm sure you must have seen some changes around. You must have seen things changing very drastically, dynamically. So let's begin by talking about this exact parameter of what all changes have you seen so far from the olden times to the contemporary times.
There have been changes, and there's no question that those changes have been in the right direction. But I do worry at times whether the process of change is too slow. As I say, I was just mentioning about the speed that the world's changing, and therefore, I do worry whether education's changing fast enough. I mean, if I go right back to my earliest days in India, I think to give some idea of the sort of situations we were dealing with then, I can recall, and I think it was probably, I was trying to work it out, probably in about 1999 or the year 2000. I was based in Gujarat, and I was invited to speak at a conference of English teachers. And there were 500 to 700 English teachers in the room, and I was welcomed onto the stage, introduced, started to speak, and within 20 or 30 seconds, I could just see from the faces that I needed to shut up and stop immediately. So I stopped, and the the organizers were at the side, and I said, look, they're not understanding a word I'm saying. Either I just quit, or you're going to need to put someone on the stage with me to translate. And that's what we had to do. So, here with this awful situation where I'm supposedly in the presence of 500 plus English teachers, and they couldn't understand an Englishman. Even though I was speaking probably slower than I would normally, not using overly elaborate language and vocabulary, but it was just, they themselves were products of an education system that had taught them English like it was a set of physics principles.
Right.
And they knew the principle. They could tell you, how to conjugate a verb and to do all of those sorts of things. But they didn't have communicative competence. And that really was a very stark lesson in the fact that, whether it's language learning or the basic literacy, it's no use if you can't use it. You've got to be able to practically use it, and that's about the functionality of what you're learning. And in that sense, far better to learn far less, but have functional use of it, than to be, weighing the system down by trying to learn more and more and more.
Absolutely, and that's very rightly pointed out that if it's not coming to use, it's of really no use in that sense. And I think that also depends, that kind of use that we do also depends on how schools largely sort of encapsulate that sort of learning method, or largely, Indian. Let's talk about India in that sense. I think that also depends on the way that schools try to navigate through these literacy and numeracy based initiatives. Because if you tackle illiteracy, it needs to have an interest model. Like the learner should be interested, right? The learner should be looking forward. As you said, these English teachers who did not know English, they need to have an interest to know English, and that's where it starts navigating towards a change. Talking about this interest creation model, Mark, you've seen a lot of schools, you've seen a lot of curriculums and pedagogies, I'm sure. Do you think the Indian schooling system, because of rote learning, has certainly lacked this sort of interest creation in students or even teachers for that matter?
I think the degree to which, when it comes to interest creation, it starts long before school. And the best chance of learning literacy and math skills at the foundational level is a desire to know those things. And from my own experience, that is so much more likely if the child is growing up in an environment where they see at least one, if not both, of their parents reading on a regular basis, using numbers on a regular basis, and are surrounded by books and reading materials. I mean, my own son, when he was growing up, by the time he went to school, he was already reading. And in fact, in the traditional and conventional sense of an Indian classroom, that was a problem for the teacher, because the teacher sort of wanted him to sit in the corner and wait for everybody else to catch up. Why was he reading? Well, right since he was extremely small, he was being read to every day. It got to the point where, for example, there was one, he had a number of books, but there was one particular book that just was such a passion for him that if he had it read to him 4 times in a day, that wasn't enough. And he would hound me and chase me around the house for another reading, right from when he got up in the morning to when he went to bed at night. So this desire and this basic foundational awareness that these symbols on a page represent meaning and the key to a door, if you like, the key to a door of knowledge and understanding of the world around. And I think when the child has that connection of that having that key in their hand, motivation is not a problem. Motivation will be there in spadeful. because the child has that desire.
Right, and you really rightly said that that key to open the door, or that key to opening the door, is in the child's hand, and I think also in the galvanizers or the teacher's hands. Because I would also like to tell our audiences, and also just have a point here, that what Devi Sansthan does with the ALfA pedagogy, with the transformative ALfA pedagogy, is essentially giving this key to the child of this door that they themselves open, they themselves look at it.
Yeah.
Uh, and now since we are talking about opening the door, since we are talking about getting this child to another setup than rote learning, we think of alternative methods, right? How do you think that these alternative methods, one, what are these alternative methods, and b, how do you think that these alternative methods help in engaging students more? Things like, say, peer-based learning, or learning in a pair, or sitting together and learning through symbols, as you said. uh, where do you see it?
To me, there's a certain sad irony when I look at the situation in India, particularly, and obviously having spent a lot of years in India, and with the fact that my time in India started in Gujarat, and to learn when I first got to Gujarat that there was this very, very strong historical connection with Madame Montessori, and that she had been there in Ahmedabad, and that great work had been done using and applying principles, that therefore we have to say are not particularly new when we're having this discussion in 2024. I mean, she was doing things, and educators trained by her were doing things that were progressive and innovative, and producing far better results, far quicker, for far bigger proportions of the students in each classroom. The mystery at times for me has been why that didn't take root to a far greater extent and become an integral part of the overall system, and why therefore anyone who even hints at methodologies that look more like Montessori is
Right.
considered to be somewhere out on a fringe, as opposed to being at the hardcore principles of what's to be applied in education. I think there have been times and certain things which may have held things back. One example, for example, one thing that stood out for me a lot and is still there to a large degree today is when you look at the international schools and the private schools. In most developing countries, the parents want to see international educators.
Mm.
And you will have schools. I mean, you mentioned about my time with Tenby in Malaysia. So as mid-price schools, generally they would have between 25 to 35 or 40% of the educators would be international. And they
Right.
would come from a very, very broad spread of countries. I mean, I can remember in one of the countries at one time, I think we had educators from 40 different countries. And so you've got an international melting pot of methodologies and approaches and all sorts of other things. Unfortunately, what I tended to see in India was that all too often the Indian parents and the educators would say, no, that's not what our parents want. What our parents want is an Indian educator who's received international training, but then often has taken that training and distilled it and condensed it into something which is acceptable
Right.
to the existing Indian model, and therefore doesn't push the boundaries as quickly and hard as it might otherwise.
Right.
We saw some years back when the International Baccalaureate Organization was pushing into India at a far greater rate, and quite a number of Indian schools were taking up IB.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no question, and I had some off-the-record conversations with representatives from IB who kind of, off-the-record, admitted that in going into India as big as they did, they accepted and sort of tolerated to a degree that what would manifest in India would be a far more teacher-centric model of IB than they normally looked for in any other country where it was being delivered by international educators.
Right.
And so I think, somewhere along the way, those things have slowed the progress, and set up challenges. Even today, yes, parents will often be quite impressed and happy if they hear that some of the teachers from their school have had a 2-week trip to Finland or Sweden or Singapore or somewhere to go and see how it's done there. But there's a world of difference between that and being immersed in those different systems, and those different approaches. Um,
So there
and
is a
having
larger need for different approaches, and there is a larger need for alternative methods, is what we have agreed upon, right? Also, because this population of children, this population of students, and even learners for that matter, who are dealing with problems like illiteracy, they do need a new approach, so to speak, a new approach which is progressive, as you said.
Well, but again, I mean, I think we need to be careful about using words like new and progressive, because that kind of implies that there's something untested and um, almost risky that we're doing sort of out on the edges of what's ever been done before.
Right.
And there's real irony in this, because some of my motivation to actually move into the education field when I left private banking was that I had come across and been exposed to a growing body of material that was not new, even back then in the latter stages of the 20th century.
Right.
Um, and yet there is something weird about some of this. I mean, one of the best examples, on the shelves behind me are a lot of books. And outside the room, there are more shelves of books. In my home, I have something like 1,300 books. But tucked away on the shelf behind me is a book called Accelerated Learning by a British writer named Colin Rose, first published in 1985. Not new. And in terms of the evidence presented about many of the things that it talks about, not particularly, sort of out there, weird or wonderful in terms of what it was doing. But backed by an awful lot of evidence coming out of a variety of different countries around the world of some really effective ways of approaching learning. And there was even going back to that material. Now, what's weird is that book is out of print. You can't find a copy of that book now. And I've had a number of occasions people have asked to borrow it, and I don't dare let it out of my hands anymore, because it's that precious. It's not even in print anymore. But for example, the idea that the learning happens way more effectively if you spiral curriculum. So you are revisiting the same material at different levels of complexity as you go up in age. There's references to the Ebbinghaus curve of forgetting, and methodologies by which students can prepare for examinations or just to consolidate their learning, as opposed to this idea that somehow you expose a child to some piece of information or knowledge once, and they're supposed to now have it, and it's supposed to be with them forever. Is just plain naive. That's not how the human brain works. Other interesting things are that, and some of these are even worldwide. I was very fortunate back in around 2010, 2011 to have a study tour in the US, during which got to meet some amazing people. Sal Khan from Khan Academy, Dr. Howard Gardner, representatives and people at quite a number of universities. But one of the things that stuck in my mind most was a conversation with the Dean of the School of Education at Stanford. And she said, I'm actually embarrassed to admit that only just, and so as I say, this was around 2010, I think, 2010, 2011. She said, we have only just put in place a formal memorandum of understanding between the School of Education and the Stanford Medical School's Department of Neurology. Neurology. In other words, here we are as educators, the raw material we work with is human brains, and yet we have no established link between the School of Education and the School of brain science, basically,
Right.
within the medical field. And, worldwide, I think in the last 10, 15 years, that's been one of the big moves forward. And as we've come to know more and more about those neurological differences, then we just cannot tolerate accepting that we're going to keep doing things the way we've done them before and do them the old ways, when we know that it's so out of line with the way that the brain works.
Right. And I completely agree on that. And also, it's a lot of back and forth with regards to that evidence based learning, because even when this teacher points out to you, even when this education dignitary, she pointed out to you about what are the lackings, the loopholes. I think what's lacking rather majorly, especially in an Indian context here, since we're talking about it, is this idea of accepting an evidence-based learning, that okay, this is not A to B to Z, but it's rather much more than that. And I think that's where alternative methods also come into picture. We both agree on that. But more than alternative methods, I think there have been multiple attempts of engaging students and engaging schools within the spectrum of learning, right? And those students have been engaged through peer-based assignments or through student-oriented learning in that sense. So when we talk of this evidence-based learning, when we talk of the space where students are getting engaged through that sort of through that sort of peer-based learning,
Mhm.
where do you see the future of it, and how do you see the future of student-oriented learning so far?
Ah, I guess my starting point in answering that is in what world and on what planet should we have ever believed that education should not put the learner at the center of everything? Um,
True.
that somehow our curriculum, our syllabus, the what we're going to teach is more important than the learner. Um, when I was involved with the first significant school that I was involved with setting up, I can remember one of the phrases that I adopted that I used to use repeatedly with teachers, because it was an interesting situation. I'm not going to necessarily name the school or even say where it was, but um, the owners were not permitting us to pay even the legal minimum wage for teachers. So we were taking mostly teachers who were freshers. So freshers with a brand new a brand new B.Ed in their pocket, but we know how little value, unfortunately, there is in the Indian B.Ed, and that's reflected in many ways. Um, but nevertheless, these teachers, if they came with anything, they were young, they were enthusiastic, they were open to learn. And one of the phrases I used to use with them repeatedly was, "We're not here to teach stuff, we're here to teach children." And I used to say to them very openly, if you come to me and try to engage me in long and involved conversations about stuff, don't be surprised if I glaze over, get bored, and start looking out the window. If you come and talk to me about children, we'll have great conversation.
Yes.
If you want to talk about children and their learning, then let's talk. If you want to talk about stuff and whether this bit of stuff should come before or after that bit of stuff, or whether that stuff should be in the exam at the end of the year or not, don't care. Not interested. um,
So largely, but more what I'm looking at or what I'm hinting at more is this peer-based learning, which is to say a student making the other student learn, and then both of them sitting in pairs and exploring things about what they have to learn, getting an interest, as I asked you earlier. Also, what do you feel about that way of learning?
we've known for a long time in adult education and adult learning that one of the best and most effective ways of learning something is to teach it to someone else. And if that was true for adults, then why would it ever have not been true for children? So and I think the other key and very obvious part of it is that we shouldn't completely denigrate rote learning. There are certain things that are actually quite usefully acquired through rote processes. Um, but they're modest in quantity, and it's certainly not everything at all. Um, when a teacher, especially, and we have to face realities in large numbers of government schools, teachers still may well have classes of at least 40 students to a class. And when it's purely teacher-centric, and even where the teacher is engaging in a question and answer process with the students, the actual amount of active connection with each of those children within a single learning period is really very minuscule. But if you actually move out of the way and let even part of that time be used by the students being engaged with teaching each other things, then just because of the sheer fact that you've replaced what might be 1 minute per student, or even adding up to no more than maybe 12 or 13 minutes in a school day,
Right.
and now suddenly that child is getting way more minutes of being actively engaged in the learning process, either as a giver or a receiver, or as both. It has to be better. It's inevitable.
There's that aspect of involvement of that child that becomes very important in the classroom, right, Mark? And that I think is what also is our belief at Devi Sansthan in ALfA pedagogy, where we bring the focus to the child, we bring the focus to the learners themselves and what they want to perceive and what they want to learn. uh, we've talked a lot about alternative method. We've talked a lot about peer-based learning. We've also talked a lot about how this learning can be manifested through teachers or through schools, as you correctly pointed out, that the teacher also needs to have a question answer sense, right? I would like to inform our audiences as well, and you as well, that what we do at ALfA, where we accelerate learning for all, what we do there is a peer based form of learning. What we do there is we galvanize the students through a galvanizer, and we motivate and inspire those learners to solve the issues or solve the problems by themselves through the ways of symbolism and through the ways of having particularly uh, non-abstract things, or having from non-abstract to abstract. That's how we're moving. And that knowledge of sounds and that knowledge of symbols is what we are looking at, right?
Mm.
So when we talk of such a pedagogy, or when we talk of the ALfA pedagogy, the accelerating learning for all pedagogy, uh, we also believe in teaching holistic values through such learnings, right? And as more and more times pass by, we agree that students or learners largely need those holistic values. uh, what do you think are these holistic values, and how do these help in the growth of a child, like growth of a child, and like how does it help in larger educational goals achievement?
I, I guess one way perhaps I'd like to answer that with a little story. I can recall an occasion where I'd gone to visit a school, and being shown around the school by the management and the leadership team. We're very proud of the school, and I think they'd only been in their premises for a couple of years, and the school had been quite successful. They had quite a lot of students. And we're walking around, and we went into a number of classrooms. And there was one particular classroom that we went into. Um, that would be maybe grade 3, if I remember rightly. And the children were having an environment lesson. And it was very, very lively, and there's lots of to and fro, and and they're making some posters and all sorts of other things about do's and don'ts, things that we should and shouldn't do in our lives, in terms of our positive or negative effect on the environment around us. Oh, that's lovely, that's great, wonderful. And we moved on, and we went off, and then I think we went and had some lunch. And then sitting with the principal in her office, and her phone rings, and she said, "Oh, just need to pop outside. We've got some new school buses, some new routes starting, and so we need to sort of flag them off, um, inaugural first day of these new bus routes." So she said, "Oh, you can either stay here or come along." So I said, "Oh, I'll come." So we went out, and standing by these lovely sparkling yellow buses, were teachers with bowls of candies and each child was allowed to take 2 candies as they got on the bus. You can probably guess where this story is going. As the buses started to pull out from the school premises, you could see out of the side windows showers of sweet wrappers, candy wrappers coming flying out the windows. And I could see some of the children were some of those grade 3 children who'd been in that environment club, talking about the do's and don'ts of what you do to protect the environment. The interest of the student, the understanding that the student doesn't split life and learning and treat them somehow as 2 separate things, but understands that they are intertwined. If you don't get that, then there's been no learning. The fact that they could parrot out, 10 things you should do for the environment in response to an exam question maybe at the end of the year is irrelevant if nothing's changed in the way they live their life.
So, Mark, as we close this conversation, and it has been a wonderful time talking to you. But before we conclude this, I would like to know your thoughts more on accelerating learning for all, ALfA, the ALfA methodology by Dr. Gandhi. What do you think, and how do you think is it helping?
Well, I think for my thoughts, I mean, my starting point would really be the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. And it's goal number 4, which of course highlights the issues of foundational literacy and that sort of thing. And being slightly older in years than you are, I'm old enough to remember and to maybe be slightly cynical of the world we live in, that the SDGs replaced something else. There was something came before, the Millennium Development Goals. And the issue of universal primary education was supposed to have been achieved across the world. And yet, when you went back and looked at the Millennium Development Goals, probably that was the one where there had to be the most disappointment worldwide in the amount of progress. Enormous strides have been made in the last 25 years on poverty eradication, starvation, around issues of survival rates of newborn babies, and so many of those things, which are not only about basic human rights for any person anywhere in the world, but are also foundational in terms of a secure, safe, and happy world where people can fulfill their potential, and that minimizes the likelihoods and chances of wars and other catastrophes and negative impact on the environment and all those sorts of things. And when we've not been doing a good enough job on those things worldwide, then the world has to have its eyes and ears open for any new initiative which promises progress. And when I look at the ALfA, I mean, I think already in a relatively short time, all the evidence seems to be pointing to something which is really, really making a difference and has the potential to really snowball into something which will be far, far greater. And I think the fact that it takes the existing infrastructure of schools and says, well, look, we can't necessarily change those things. People have tried to change a lot of the fundamentals in the existing education. But if we can just get that basic foundational level literacy and numeracy skill embedded and do it in a much shorter time, the amount of time that the existing processes take because they're so ineffective is a tragedy. I've recently had interactions with 3 or 4 different children from different families where the children were going to different schools. And the families were very proud of the fact that their children had not only been learning Khmer language, the Cambodian language, but also they learned some English, apparently, and they learned the alphabet. And what would happen was in every case with these children, they would parrot to me A, B, C, D, E, F, G, da, 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 and they would just run along the line with their fingers. But if I took a piece of paper and wrote an individual letter on it and held it up to the child, they couldn't tell me what letter it was.
Right,
They didn't. There was no, and therefore, and as well, there's no connection going on there with the
right,
basics of phonics learning. Now, phonics is an interesting one. America, a country that spends enormous funds on education, vast sums of money on the education of its children, has just within the last 12 months taken a massive U-turn across the country in terms of their approaches to how reading is taught. Because there were die-hard fundamentalists who refused to buy into the idea that there was anything to be learned from phonics or anything relating to phonics in terms of how reading was taught. And only when they finally gave in to the ever-growing weight of evidence that they were wrong, did then all the state education boards right across the country suddenly changed their approaches to what was mandated in terms of what went on in their schools.
right.
So it's this issue of fundamental literacy and numeracy. It's not about the money. It's not about how much money is spent. It's not about denigrating teachers. Too often teachers are just really doing what they've been told to do and what they're incentivized to do. And therefore, I think, an initiative like ALfA to me is a breath of fresh air, and it offers ways forward, which I think can only be encouraged.
That's very kind of you. And we do believe here that initiatives like ALfA do open up the doors for children, as you mentioned in the talk earlier. It also does open a lot of doors for the education system, administration largely. And anybody who's watching it, we would love for you to implement ALfA at your schools, at your educational institutions, because when you make children learn from abstract, it's always a great way to learn. And when you learn through symbols, when you learn through signs, it's always a lovely way to grow. It has been a wonderful conversation with you, minus the technical glitches, Mark. But I'm really, really glad and grateful for you to join in. Anything that you want to say to our audiences, or your message to our audiences before we close this conversation?
I think a lot of it I've already said, but more than anything, the work that we get to do is an honour in terms of our opportunities to work on things and to work in ways which lay down foundations on which a child can set out the map for the potential that they want to live, and not just in small numbers, but potentially in vast and massive numbers. And getting things better in education has the potential to change the fundamental course for humanity. And I don't think that's making too big of it. So, like I said, what we get to do every day is a privilege and an honor. And I love interacting with other people who share that enthusiasm and that drive to make a difference. So it's been a pleasure, and thank you. And more power to all of you at doing the work you are doing with ALfA, and to all other educators. There is a long road ahead. There is a lot of work to do, and there's abundant benefits to come out of doing that work.
Absolutely. And we agree on this mission. We agree literacy and education, making a stronger future together. Thank you so much for joining in, Mark. I'm really grateful on behalf of the entire family at DEVI Sansthan. I hope you had a great time discussing these important
Yes.
concerns and issues with us. We're really grateful to everybody watching it. Do subscribe to DEVI Sansthan and come back for another episode of Detox. Until then, goodbye. Have a great day. Thank you so much, everybody.